Again in studio, this time about lemons, but also a $6 million film that you are actually watching or listening right now. To understand Voidman, it's not easy, but also different forms of the dependency together with the server and the surface. To understand the simple deprogramming is very, very difficult, and 90% of users could not access that complex program. To understand different forms of the static code, it's not easy, but every simple decode you can actually also open together with the simple online compiler and editor. In the editor, you can actually decode the simple void main together with different starting programs. To understand algorithms, probably it's also important if you are working for anyone famous. To understand any forms of the value together with famous people, you sooner or later figure it out that they do not have any relation with server. To understand how much downloads some human have related to their packages or picture, you'll also understand their fame. To understand different forms of simple deeds not easy, but also in the way you can restore the site from your history. To understand different forms of treats that are on the web, it's also important. It is not easy to build better configurations together with website, but it's also not easy to understand all those treats that are on the internet. Usually, you must disable millions of colors so you can actually work better. You'll also understand many worker treats that are on the web because the workers are building numbers and those are some sort of treats. To understand different forms, but also what is possible to build together with the expression or program, it's not easy to understand that. To understand different forms, but also different forms of simple hubs of microends, it's not easy. But also all those different packages together with the picture are picture only. Sometimes the picture only explain more that people are actually thinking. Sometimes people want to think about more and more and more, but sometimes picture explain everything. It is very important to understand very simple version of console or very simple version of editors also for simple decode. To understand different forms of style of the editor is also important if you are going to build more complex site. Of course, there is also thousands of different buttons, but also different forms of the menu together with the site if you are actually building more complex site. It is very important to understand configuration with Ubuntu if you are going to explore microends deeper. But on the background of your desktop, there might be millions of the photos of the nature, and that do not mean anything special. The nature only means nature and not application. Once you understand that you only have the picture of the nature on your desktop, you are also going to understand better what code is about. The code is about simple coding and not very difficult things. A lot of people want to achieve more followers or more like, but that do not mean anything. That do not mean that you are actually owner of more and more products or store. To understand different forms of the dogs, but also different forms of the badge, it's not easy. There are thousands of different reference, also how to build the coding library, but also how to build better options for the microends library with code. To understand different forms, but also how to replace the dangerous words is also important together with the code. Sometimes it is very important also to understand the simple compilers. Simple compilers are very, very important. Also, thousands of different buttons that you can find together with MicroEnt's hub. To understand the web freaks, it's not easy because those might have slightly more illness than those coders that only code together with simple PC. To be different than others is actually much, much more difficult than it looks. A lot of people think that it is very, very easy to change habit or very, very easy to build quality code, but that's not correct. Most of those sites, companies, and code fail. You will not make your excellent currency, even if you have many ledgers. You must also think about contribution. Without contribution, there is nothing. Every famous human in this world made some contribution to this world or for their city or cities around. But sometimes you should also look that this world is one big city and nothing else. To improve this world is not easy, but also sometimes not easy to think about different forms of the flags, but also different forms of symbols and code. To understand the DMD, but also different forms of the net paths, it's not easy. And sometimes it is very, very difficult to understand different forms of the front ends. To understand the simple DMD together with the elegant site, it's not easy, especially if you also understand the design of BRBS. Not easy to understand all those coders and developers and what they are actually thinking through the year. To understand the dependencies, but ignoring the maps that might be used in code, you will actually figure it out. The different forms of quality codes are actually your assets. To understand different forms of actions in code, it's not easy, especially if you are trying to build the safety together with the compilers. Millions of issues in this world. But if you want to build an app or simple program, you should actually also use the simple compilers and more simple DMD code. Do not define meanings if you are trying to build something very, very simple and for the end users. Sometimes do not catch yourself hanging on different complex hubs and dependencies. You should actually build something for self and share it to many people, but not too many. Sometimes also chilling, and chilling actually means making film or making a better life. It is very important to make a better life for yourself and not to compare with other versions. If you do not compare with other versions, you'll actually see millions of different beta and millions of different alpha forms, but also very, very complex forms of the code. To understand complex forms of the code, it's not easy because once you understand the complex forms of the code, you understand those might be some sort of an assets. Some people even think that code might be like stock, but that's not actually correct until you own some company or at least you own some brand. To understand safety, it's not easy, especially together with coding. Some people even think that open source is the most important. But the open source it's not as much important as we think because usually it is very important to charge for every film, to charge for every product. Also the product like this, also the products like topics. For example, the topics in Facebook have 0% value and that might be the biggest problem of their projects. But what do I know? Do not compare if you are going to build your simple division of simple face. To understand the automation together with the surface is not easy, But once you realize that coding surface have nothing to do with Facebook, you'll actually understand better the developers. The developers are very, very complex sometimes, but there are also the thousands of different enterprises that actually exist. Some people also team, but not all. And once you think about the team, you should actually forget the team. There is no such a team that is going to be there forever. In life, you should actually also forget on all the tools and you should focus on the ethics. All those games in engine are too fake to build company or to make contribution for any city in this world. If you'll understand the code, you'll also understand that ethics are more important than code itself. And sometimes also important to open some journalism. Of course, to open and close journalism might be also important. The design essentials might include some pictures that are actually stored in containers, not more about pictures when it comes to the code. To understand different tools or what developers are actually developing, you should actually forget on all the tools and all the developers in applications if you are going to build simple ethics or more simple automation. Automation for different forms of code platforms, it's not easy, but also not easy to configure different forms for the life and safety automation. To understand the IT forms, it's not easy, but also to maintain different forms of the site. You could never automate everything in your life and never predict safety. A lot of people try to predict, but they might fail. To understand coding, sometimes it's not easy, but you can also see different forms of the forums. You can actually also build the site, sometimes similar to the forum by yourself. And in life, when you see something is actually trending, that's actually not so much important because the classics are much, much more important. Once you think about microants C++, but also different forms of the purpose with ethics, you might also see that those millions of pictures of nature are actually very important because they remind us about the nature. Sometimes the nature and picture of nature are even more important than code itself. Sometimes all those algorithms are not important. All those algorithms about famous people are not important. And it is very, very important to build the most simple automatization you can. And for many developers, they are going to build the AP or app or superior menus or superior code. But if you are more simple or even stock owner, maybe you should only think about for basics of yourself, but also how to pay people if they are working for you. In life, it's not easy, especially if you also know to understand different forms of Atom code, but also to understand different forms of Azure. Sometimes some developers only focus on program or only focus on the code, which is 100% incorrect. That might even result in disease. Sometimes it is very, very important to build simple lexical forms, but also the grammar for the code. Together with the statements and ethics, you can build much better arrays, much better classes, and much more ethical interfaces. To understand different forms of type of servers is also important if you are going to support millions of pictures. To understand template in microants, it's also not easy, but also different forms of collections of microants picture that are representing the simple code. Those are not only for developers, but for every human that would like to build ethical life for themselves. To understand the instruction in the internet, it's not easy because it's very, very unchangeable. Internet It could never change in ethics, and it is very, very robust. It becomes even dangerous once you develop it too much. So forget the applications that you actually develop is sometimes part of the ethics for those that have some value. Not easy for developers to forget the applications you are coding in. To understand the change in world is also not easy. But if you are thinking about elegance in medicine, you are going to see that it is very, very, very complex to build ethical code. And the programmers might not understand you what you think with elegant. So it is very important to understand that sometimes life, if you are coding, will become simply too complex, and life, if you are having company, will become too complex. Or life, if you are having any type of brand or design, might become too complex, and on the end, you might need to forget everything. You will need to find another method. You will need to find another method for life, another method for health, and another method to build a safe code. Not very easy.